everyone. Welcome to the Tulsa World Opinion Editorial Video Podcast. I am Ginnie Graham, the editorials editor.
I'm Bob Doucette, editorial writer.
And this video is available on podcast through Google, iTunes, and Spotify. So check us out that way too. So we thought that we would take this time to give some impressions of the state of the state. Governor Kevin Stitt yesterday gave the state of the state, which is a tradition every governor has every year. And, there's always a mixed bag of good and bad, in our opinion. So I'm just going to start out asking Bob, not after me, of course, because I'm talking, I guess, the impression. And I was thinking like adjectives. How do we describe our impression of the state of the state? And I don't mean this mean. I really don't, but I just kind of came away with like sameness. I really don't know whether that's a word, but I'm just going to call it sameness. Only because, I've been hearing and reading State of the States for, seems like forever. I know, Bob, you have too in this business. And there is a sameness to them. And every governor will get up and take credit for all the wonderful things and not take blame for any of the things, the bad things, or in some cases, including this one, just pretend the bad things don't exist. So, and that's the same. I mean, you want to present a positive outlook. And I think that's what he was trying to achieve, setting out his own priorities. But, I didn't think it was anything like groundbreaking. So, I mean, what are your adjectives that you came up with?
Well, I think a lot of what I saw, and I owe a lot of this to basically the makeup of the legislature, is the governor knew he was talking to a friendly audience. 3/4 of the legislature is Republican. I think they've all come around. Whatever sort of legislative governor's office conflicts existed in the first couple of years, it seems as if that stuff has been kind of swept away. And it sounded like, bear with me on this, but in a lot of ways it sounded like a victory lap. It's like, look at all the great stuff. And one of the cues that I saw that I thought was interesting, and I wonder if this was something that somebody told him to do, but he'd make a point, and then everyone starts clapping, and then he'd start clapping, which was weird because it's almost like a comedian laughing at their own jokes. I thought that was a very strange thing, but
yeah, I never noticed that. I'm gonna start doing that for me. I'm gonna start clapping for myself around the house. Yay!
Good job, Ginnie. Good job.
That's amazing. Yeah.
So, but it was a lot like what you said, and it is reflected in the budget that's being proposed. He's going for another flat budget. So
yeah, I mean, we have extra money and we're putting it in savings. So all of these things that he's talking about, we do with and we'll find out for certain how much money the legislature has to spend later this month. Right. I think it's the Board of Equalization will meet. But I'll just start with, where I found agreement, because I think with everything, you should try to find some common ground first. Yep. And for me, that was when he mentioned the hope theory. And I know some people mocked it because I just don't think they understand it. The theory of hope is an actual theory that was developed by a University of Oklahoma, Tulsa researcher, Dr. Chan Hellman. And I met Dr. Hellman more than a decade ago when he was sort of first developing this idea. And it basically, he's taking, he's a numbers guy, and he took the idea of how much do people have hope? And it's really a fancy way of saying goal setting. Do people feel when you have hope, you have a goal to meet? How optimistic is a person to meet that goal? And he came across this in places like homeless shelters and places where you would think there would be very low, optimism and hope. And he found the opposite, that it's something that can be measurable. And so he has spent, the greater part of 15 or 20 years developing this, and it's been embraced by national nonprofits, one dealing with domestic violence, a lot of homeless shelters here locally, a lot of nonprofits locally, and the Department of Education. Joy Hoffmeister got in on it a few years ago and started piloting how that would look, how taking that theory and applying it in schools. And Sarah Stitt developed her own foundation to promote this. So, I know that Joy Hoffmeister and Kevin Stitt are going to be running against each other, but they do agree that this is a legitimate research, science-based idea. And he wants to apply that across all state agencies. How that will look in real life, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how the department, guy who's inspecting pork plants will benefit from that, but maybe. So it'll be interesting. But and I do want to say it's not a substitute for brain health. It's tied to those mental health issues, but it's not services for mental health or things like that. This is tied to it, but not a replacement. So where did you find, what was an agreeable point for you?
Well, there's a few things that I thought were worth highlighting, and or things that intrigued me, I guess.
Yeah.
So the first thing that intrigued me was he was talking about, it sounded like a plan for consolidating state law enforcement. And I'd like to know more about that. Are we looking at possibly creating a unified state police where you're melding in OSBI, OBN, the Highway Patrol, or something like that? Is that what we're looking at here? And if whether it's better or not, I can't say for sure, but it is interesting because that would be a major change in state law enforcement.
Yeah, so I want to look at state agencies that did that before. Do you want one big state agency with one person at the top, or do we like the smaller agencies that in theory are more accessible? I don't know. So that was intriguing too.
Hard to say, but I'm interested in that. And I think it was a good thing to highlight some of the things of how state finance has turned around, because it was bad. You remember how it was in the second term under Mary Fallon, revenue failures, budget cuts and all this sort of stuff. It was bad. So we have come a ways from that. And that is a good thing to know, at least going forward, that, it's being reflected in the state's bond rating and stuff like that. So there are tangible things that tell us economically the state is doing fairly well in comparison to maybe some other places that are not. Now it's taking digs at other states and stuff like that. I mean, let's hold off on that, because if we want to bust on other states and everything, you got to look at what they're doing right and that we're not doing.
All right. I mean, keep in mind, we still have, we cut our corporate and personal income tax last year, to the top. And so we were promised that will come back to us as, it'll invest back in the community and make our state budget grow, but we haven't realized that yet. So to me, until we start, and there's on the budget, he wants to cut more taxes, it sounds like, through groceries and personal income. And I'm leery of it. Not that I like high taxes, but I just don't want to go back to those days.
I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop. Yeah, I'm kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop, because when these taxes started getting cut, in the past, what that has meant was we're cutting taxes, yay, taxpayers happy. Mm-hmm. But then you have to start finding ways to make up for that lost money, because traditionally speaking, in any state that has done this, cut taxes to the bone, is invariably you end up having to cut services, cut budgets, and things start falling through the cracks in a major way. We haven't seen that yet. But will we? And that's what usually happens.
Well, we're also, I think I mentioned this last week, we're a little drunk on federal aid right now. I mean, we've had a lot of relief, not just coming through the state, but individuals. I mean, we've gotten, businesses have gotten grants to stay afloat. So all that's going to go away. And so I'm just leery of, I just want to see the dust settle. Well,
if we have an economic downturn, that's where the real problem begins. When things are fine, it's like, okay, this is uncomfortable, but we're white knuckling our way through this in terms of the state budget. But if you have a downturn and you've cut all these taxes, that's when things get really bad. That's when you have the revenue failures and the massive budget cuts and doing some of the more extreme things we had to do just to make ends meet. It's good that we've got $2 billion in reserves. That's wonderful, but you can go through that pretty quick, as we saw during the pandemic and during those revenue failure days. What I'm worried about, and there weren't a lot of details with this, but I want to know more, is he talked about somehow tying income taxes and other types of taxes to state revenues. And it almost sounds like, well, what we're going to do is we're going to pull the plug on revenues while times are good. But what happens when times are bad? Does that mean the taxes go back up to shore things up? Or are we just going to slowly erode until there is no tax base? And that's a very, very strange policy thing. I don't even know what to call it, theory, that I don't quite understand what they're trying to do with that outside of saying we're just going to keep cutting taxes and everyone's going to be happy. So I don't know how that works. But in the short term, we are seeing a good revenue situation in the state. Unemployment is low. Of course, it really didn't get that bad either during the pandemic, not like a lot of other states suffered, but unemployment is low, and more or less we're kind of going along okay. I think it's not like we're all just bathing in tubs full of $100 bills or nothing like that. I mean, let's be realistic here, but definitely it could be a lot worse than it's been.
Any other areas of agreement, you think?
Well, those were the ones that
what
stuck
got
out
my
to me.
attention was he spent a lot of time on law enforcement. And the one thing he said within that was that he was interested in the mental health. I call it brain health because it's about a brain. Let's try to equate it to health, physical health. So, but he said, he goes, we're burning out law enforcement officers. They need, services in brain health. And he's right. But I would add to that, teachers who are just done and they're leaving. I mean, he didn't talk about the record numbers of resignations and retirements there, and frontline workers, healthcare frontline workers. They're going too. They're exhausted. The pandemic has stressed them out. And so we need to talk about the mental health or brain health system overall. And just last week, the consortium of Healthy Minds, which is a consortium of mental health advocates and doctors, said that the numbers are showing that we have an epidemic of youth suicide. I mean, it's alarming, an epidemic of youth suicide with the numbers since the pandemic. So we really, as a community, have to talk about this system in access, affordability, parity with insurance. And I think there's some legislation that ought to be getting to that, which as the session goes on, I hope they'll take that into account, because we can't have a healthy workforce and economy if our, essential workers are getting their mental health is sliding to the point of leaving, and our children are at risk like this. So I'll agree with him on that we need a better approach on that.
Yeah, I think that is, I would like to see that more comprehensive, but first responders and mental health care, and putting an emphasis on that. There are people I know personally who deal with that on a day-to-day basis, because the crime scenes that you go to, the accident scenes that you have to work, the fire scenes that you have to work, and so forth, you end up driving by those every day. And those are just kind of repeated small traumas that add up, and it's important that be addressed. So I think that was a good bit to get in there. A big area of disagreement that we have right now, I think, from the editorial board and just from my perspective, is he outlined, and he had a lot of pithy slogans to outline fixing public schools by using private school vouchers. And he cited Greg Treat's bill 1647 in that. And when you read that, it is just a straight up private voucher. And philosophically, what that is saying, and there's nowhere else in our state budget do we look at this way, that we pay our taxes into the government to our legislators to dole out. But for some reason with education, we're like, but what's my cut? I'm going to take my cut and spend it at this private school that I want. We don't do that with any other, I don't go to DHS and go, what's my part of the DHS part? Because I want to take that and give it to Catholic Charities adoption instead of DHS adoption. I mean, or take any example. But for some reason with public education, it's viewed as this sort of individual right rather than the communal good. And that bill in particular
is troublesome because, I mean, we already have a problem with no one holding Epic charter schools accountable when the state auditor has said she can't account for like what, 150, $145 million, or there's mismanagement. How are we going to then take more millions of dollars and put them into schools that by the law that's being proposed, they don't have to tell us where that money is going. They don't have to say whether the academic opportunity was better. So if a student from a public school takes money and gives it to a private school, how do we know their academic progress has gotten better? Because the private schools are not under any obligation to have testing or tell us where their money is going. And part of that bill says that students in what the so-called F schools can transfer out to a private school using this voucher. But how do we know the private schools, what's their grade? Everyone assumes private schools are better, and they might be for some kids, but they're not the same. And so there's no accountability in this voucher program. And to me, what's where we disagree on this and is, does this make public schools better? He had a lot of sloganeering that I think people need to get past. You know, God gave kids to parents, not government. Okay. Right. And he wants to not fund systems, but it is a system. Our communities are networks of systems. And if this doesn't improve the public schools and the public schools get worse, then that is not going to help your economic bottom line for a community. It is because businesses wanting to locate to cities, they look up, how are the public schools doing? And if our public schools are doing bad, they're not going to come here. So, let's we have an inherent disagreement there.
Yeah, let's just be honest about this. We're totally frank about the public school situation in Oklahoma. Way back, we're going to have to reach back here a few decades. We decided under House Bill 1017 that we needed to put more money in schools. We need to get more teachers in there. We need to properly fund public schools. And for the 3 decades since then, we've been doing nothing from a policy standpoint except chopping away at that. You cannot talk about record funding for common education or education in general and ignore things like a record number of teacher retirements, a record number of emergency certifications, teachers getting burned out, superintendents and administrators worried that they cannot teach anything and feel safe without someone coming along and suing them. These are the types of things that weaken a system. And all we're talking about doing here is transferring money from one system that, frankly, state government has been undermining for decades into another system, which, like you said, does not have the transparency controls needed to make sure that we're actually getting our money's worth.
Right,
and it also doesn't keep in mind of the students who do not get to take advantage of this.
Right.
We're just going to leave them out in the cold. We're just going to leave their teachers and administrators in the cold. And what's up with that?
You have a point, because it's being touted as an equity thing. But as long as there are barriers, there's no equity. As long as a private school can say, no, you can't come in here, that's not equity. And sometimes equity is as much as a parent doesn't have a car. Well, private schools are under no obligation to provide transportation where public schools do. So it is not equitable. It does not help with equity in a system. And we have asked, I reached out to Senator Greg Treat through a text message and left a voicemail with his assistant to try to meet with him to find out a little bit more about it, because I would like to know more about the thinking, because I just cannot see how this in any way helps public schools. But
well, I'll tell you this, and this will be my king thought on the whole thing. If you properly invest in your public school system and in higher education and in career tech, that strengthens your state. It strengthens your economy, and it makes you a more desirable place to do business for the industries that are here and the industries are interested in coming here. If you have a weak education system, the only kind of jobs we're going to get are distribution centers and low cost, low wage call center type of jobs. And if that's what they want, that's fine. Let's just be honest. But if we really want those high-end jobs that we're touting with, Canoe maybe coming here and whatever else we're trying to attract, you cannot weaken your public school system. You just can't do it and succeed.
And he did mention breaking down silos, which is something I've heard everyone going back to Frank Keating say that and they're right. Having kids in high school, there does need to be more of those walls being broken down between career tech and that. So I'll give him that. You mentioned things that weren't spoken about, and the big one was no mention of COVID.
Nope.
I was disappointed in that, because did you ever look up how many people have died since then? I want to say it was like 13.
It's over 13,000 and closing in on 14,000.
I mean, that's huge. And I mean, at a minimum, state leaders have mishandled this. At worst, it's been a disaster. They never got the pandemic center off the ground. There was this huge void of information. We've gone through 4 health department directors. There's, the void was filled luckily by, a consortium of doctors and Dale Bratzler from OU Medical. I mean, it took those basically, private entities and hospitals to step in and actually give us information. So that was disappointing. Did that strike you?
Yeah, it did. And it was one of those things where the governor kind of danced around it a little bit in a way that suits a political narrative that they've been trying to push lately, is that we wanted to make the pandemic affect us as least as possible, but without really doing the things that would actually mitigate the pandemic. So keep businesses open, keep the machinery of the economy running and stuff like that. So I get it. I understand it. Nobody wants to see businesses being shut down or having to limit their services or their hours and stuff like that because of the pandemic. But the thing is, I mean, we can pretend it doesn't exist. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It has taken a toll on, pretty much every area of the economy in the state and nationally. And if you really want to take a look at that and see how it is, just go through downtown and talk to some of the business owners down here who have been trying their hardest to stay open. And some longtime people just have not been able to do it for whatever reason. There's risks to workers, there's risk to owners, and there's risk to clientele that could have been more aggressively dealt with, that we just chose not to, because it just wasn't in the political cards to do it. So, that's, and we do pay for that in terms of having some of the highest per capita deaths, severe illnesses, hospitalizations, and infections. That's us. In that respect, we are a top 10 state.
Well, and the other disheartening thing was we're not even doubling down on McGirt, we're quadrupling down. Yeah. It's just, it's disheartening because recently tribal leaders have reached out through their own ways to say it's time for a reset. The Supreme Court is clear. Jurisdictionally, the reservations were never de-established. So unless Congress is going to act on that, which they have no appetite to, then state leaders and law enforcement need to get on board with the post-McGirt world. And there's been plenty of coverage to show this affected so few cases. 25,000 prisoners, only 235 affected. Almost 75% of those have already been retried and prosecuted. And of the rest, half of them were on nonviolent drug crimes, and the other half they are not violent criminals, but some of them might have been, but they fall into a kind of a zone that Congress could fix. It's a statute of limitations issue. Yeah. But that has chilled relationships that affect hunting and fishing licenses, gaming. I mean, it's just things like, and he mentioned wanting to improve infrastructure and education. Tribal governments are fantastic partners to Oklahoma. You go into county areas, they're the ones fixing county roads. They're the ones donating money to the schools. They're the ones, tribal governments step up in these small towns. And so the state of Oklahoma, while they also talk about fighting Joe Biden, when it comes to things like infrastructure, we need those partnerships. We need federal money. We need tribal partners. So this whole McGirt fight, it's just pointless at this juncture. It stands, let's move forward. And the line of, something like this leaves it up to the federal government. Well, our U.S. attorneys are Oklahomans. These aren't foreign out-of-state people who are trying these cases. They're being tried in tribal and federal courts that are here. So I hope moving forward, some of the lawmakers can help bridge that gap, because that continued fight is just not being helpful. So,
well, let's take a look at it this way. The longer we continue to do this, the longer we're going to have the uncertainty. When you start, and that was one thing that he was a major term that he used was, legal uncertainty, economic uncertainty. The path that we're on right now is just going to drag that out. Because like you said, the court said what it said, is ruled how it's ruled. And we're already starting to see local governments and other agencies partnering with the tribes to figure out how to move into the post-McGirt world. The faster we get there, the more certain things will become. Frameworks will be built. Oklahoma is a unique state. There's other states that have tribes and tribal reservations, but the state of Oklahoma is just different because of how concentrated the number of tribes are here in the state. And when we're talking about the ones affected by the McGirt decision, I'm not sure any other state has that kind of a situation going on. So what do? Do you just hold on to the past, dig in your heels, or do you try to find a path forward that works for everybody? That's already starting to happen at the micro level, but we need to start making it happen at the macro level. That's the fastest way to get through this, and that's the fastest way to smooth all this out.
I noticed in our paper this morning, he pointed out a case, and the mother was there, of a drunk driver who killed a person. And I remember at the time thinking there's got to be more to that story. And sure enough, there was. The person, the alleged defendant, is still in jail. It gave the impression that this person is out. Actually, the person is never left. He's still behind bars, awaiting a decision on an appellate court. So I thought that was a little disingenuous to hold it out like, look, we've got, violent people roaming. And in the case that he cited, I just wanted to point out that our reporters did a good job by following up and showing that defendant is not out. The person is behind bars. There's, just like with many cases, you're pending, decision. So, I know the only other thing that caught my attention was the jab at initiative petitions. And I don't want to belabor that, but I'm with a growing number of people being tired of being told I don't know what I'm voting for. I knew what I was voting for with medical marijuana. I knew the language was bad, but it's up to the legislature to fix that language, because Governor Stitt's right. We have bad actors coming in that have found loopholes. So we need to shore those up. But the answer is not to do away with the initiative petition. He mentioned these are out-of-state interests coming in. Well, no more than cut and paste legislation that conservative lawmakers get from ALEC or pro-life areas. I mean, the initiative petition at least has some requirements. You have to be an Oklahoman, an Oklahoma voter. So I would say cut out the cut and paste legislation, leave the initiative petition. And because those initiative petitions pass, and this, Bob, it's because lawmakers didn't do what they were asked for years.
That's right.
I mean, that's how people wanted to expand Medicaid. Legislature refused. So what did we do? Voters got together and said, okay, we'll pass it. People wanted medical marijuana. I mean, you can just go down a whole list of stuff. So don't get rid of the initiative petition. Just listen to the people. So
let's make Oklahoma government a little bit more, or at least retain its accountability to the people. Because now, if you look at the percentage of people who are of one party in the legislature compared to what's out there in the state, they are uneven. There are more Republicans than Democrats in Oklahoma, but it's not 3-1.
No, it's, when we talk about all Oklahomans, all Oklahomans don't necessarily look just like what our legislature does. And so I hope that the lawmakers keep that in mind. So, well, that's what I want to just remind people that that's just the executive branch's priorities. We do have a legislature. It is a co-branch. So I'm interested to hear what our leaders in the House and the Senate have to say. The governor isn't the king of the state. we do have legislators who can have power too. So it'll be interesting moving forward. I'm glad that he set out the priorities, but we have a session that's kicked off now, so it'll be interesting. Any last words, Bob?
I eagerly await the groundbreaking of Canoe and seeing cars actually roll off the production line, because it's become such a thing about how great our state is at attracting businesses. I want to see that happen.
I'd like to see some hiring happen among that too. I am looking forward to those stories as well. So
let's move some dirt and get some frames up, and let's see some hiring happen.
Well, thank you everybody for tuning in, and Bob and I will get together on Friday and do another. So thank you very much.
For more information, you can visit tulsaworld.com.